Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the newest Tamron lens, and that is the SP 35mm F1.4 DI USD. Now, this lens, codenamed F045 in Tamron, is the 40th anniversary lens, or 40th anniversary of the SP or super performing lineup from Tamron. So this represents their premium lenses, and it's often applied to both some of their zoom lenses, including some of the new G2 lenses, and then also their more recent series of SP primes. Now, this lens in many ways represents the pinnacle of the evolution that Tamron has been making over the past 5 or 6 years, in which they have moved from being, kind of a budget alternative, and much like Sigma, have repositioned themselves as premium alternatives to first-party lenses. In the case of this lens, as we saw in our first look episode, which you can check out here, it has the advantage of offering up as good, if not better, a build quality and overall handling as first-party lenses like the Canon 35L Mark II or the Nikon 35mm F1.4 G lens, while also undercutting them in price by nearly 50%. And so that puts this lens in really a fantastic position. And so it has a beautiful build, everything from a metal alloy body to internal weather sealing to flooring, coating on the front element, gasket at the back. And so it handles really nicely. It has a focus ring that actually has a smoother feel than what the equivalent Canon lens, which I happen to own, and it, in my opinion, has been the best 35mm lens overall that I have tested thus far. But I will say that this lens gives it a really fantastic run for its money. And so it really breaks down in having a beautiful build overall and a beautiful handling to it. Now, the only downside here is that it does weigh in a little bit heavier than what either the Canon or the Nikon lenses do, and in fact it weighs in heavier, even more so than the Sigma 35mm f1.4 Art. At the same time, of course, as compared to the Art lens in particular, it does offer a better build. It includes weather sealing, it's got a more robust focus system, etc., etc. I have no complaints about using it. I will note, for those, a lot of people are interested in how it handles on Sony via something like the Sigma MC11. So obviously, as has been the case with all Tamron lenses, it doesn't work as well as Sigma lenses on the MC11. And that is because, obviously the Sigma MC11 is optimized for the performance of Sigma lenses. And while Canon and Tamron lenses, they do work on it typically, they don't work as well. And so in this case, I actually found that focus was actually fairly good, and IAF, as we'll see in our portrait section in just a minute, is fantastic. However, I did find that combination over about 70 to 80 shots that it locked up the camera at least 3 or 4 times. And so something about that particular combination, at the moment at least, on my A7R Mark III and most recent firmware update as of today on the MC11 and the 35mm f1.4 lens, that combination will cause the camera to lock up periodically. So what happens when it freezes is you have to just power cycle. In other words, you have to turn it off and back on. That clears it and you can proceed. But just know that it's not a flawless performer when it comes to that. And so final analysis, I would say for casual work, for portrait work, I would say go for it if you're interested in that combination. However, if you're wanting to do more serious like event work, say you're wanting to use it for weddings, I would use it at weddings for posed shots. I wouldn't personally use it for any of the ceremony shots because I would be afraid that autofocus, or the lockup might happen at a moment where you can't afford to lose the shot. So your mileage may vary, but I just wanted to give you my observations on that. Now, in a second episode, we took a look at the image quality, and I'd recommend that you look at that while we break things down more thoroughly. What I didn't cover as a part of that was a more detailed look at how it handles for portrait. So we'll do that right now. Let's jump in and take a look at how it performs for portrait work. All of these are going to be shot wide open f1.4. I'm using some Godox V1S flashes, and I'm adapting it via the Sigma MC11 on Sony for these shots. So obviously you get the advantage of IAF, and as you can see, IAF has worked beautifully here. And even at f1.4, there's huge amounts of skin tones here. And also the actual skin tones in terms of the color are really great. Even though you get a little bit of perspective distortion at a 35mm, I like the end result here, even at a fairly close focus distance. And as you can see, after the textures pop in here, that once again, even at f1.4, we've got really fantastic detail in the skin tones, and also, of course, really good contrast and detail in the highlights. And the bokeh looks nice here, even though this is maybe a little bit of a complicated background. Here's another here, and on this one I've actually done a bit of processing just to the general look, thrown a quick preset on there in Lightroom. But once again, as you can see, all of the same truths remain here, that we've got really great detail at f1.4. I mean, focus is nailed. Its skin tones look nice, and then of course the background looks nice. Now, if we move out to more of a medium distance, and so obviously your depth of field is not going to be as shallow. You're not going to get as much compression of a background, but that's part of the look here. And once again, there's a preset that's been added on here. But what we have got is a really crisp delineation of our areas of focus. Background looks nice. And again, even at f1.4, we've got really great contrast and detail on the subject. IAF has worked well here. And so we still have that kind of three-dimensional cutout look, even at a medium distance. Let's get one more here. And again, color processed, because I'm doing portraits, but I want you to show that everything along the plane of focus is super crisp, really well delineated. And then of course our subject, great detail on our subject, and a nice separation from the background here. And so as far as portrait work, this lens does fantastic. So as you can see, really good news on that front. Portrait work is fantastic. Now, as I tend to do in my final episode, I also give a little more detailed analysis on how the autofocus works. So in this case, autofocus on my Canon 5D Mark IV, which is the primary place that I tested it. I did some minor tweaking of autofocus for a bit of a front focus issue, and so I pulled focus back a little bit to get more consistent performance for that. And after that, my real-world results were really excellent. I also did some formal tests, and so let's just take a quick look at this. Let's take a look at the focus speed of the Tamron here to the target. Completely defocused. And then we'll go the opposite direction and focus. Okay. Let's do it again. Okay. All right, let's run the same test here with the Canon. So we'll completely defocus and, all right, let's do that again. And one more time. Let's go the other way. Focused. Focused. All right, so what we did is I set up this test, which is something that I'll sometimes use in calibrating focus. And what I did is then would set up to focus, defocus all the way down to minimum focus. And so it has to do a long focus pull. And then I would also, I did 10 of those defocus, and then I did 5 where I focused to infinity. So it had a shorter pullback, but sometimes that does affect focus performance as well. So then what we did is I cropped all the images in equally, both from the Tamron and from the Canon. And so I could just focus in on the aspect of focus, and we could take a look at how they perform. So the nice thing about this is that this part is angled. So you have front focus, you have back focus, and then you have, what should be the accurate focus, with this being the target. And so, with something like this, you should see a fairly consistent result between front focus and back focus. So in this case, this would rate as a 5-star result, because it is focused most perfectly on this line right here. Now this is what I called a 4-star result here, and you can see that focus is actually about in this area here, and so back focus has become a little too defocused, front focus is more in focus, and so we've got a little bit of a shift forward. But at the same time, it's close enough that you would still call that a passable result. Now this was the one result that I called a 3, And that is because while focus is still on the subject, you can see that it's front focused even more so. And so this is the area that's in focus. Back focus is now completely out of focus, and even front focus is a little bit out of focus. And so I would say that this is enough of a missed focus that I probably would not be happy with the focus result. Even though if this was someone's face, you would probably be getting, you know, something like their nose in focus rather than their eye. So if we look at my results here from the defocus towards minimum focus, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 in a row that are perfectly focused. We have 1, 2 in the middle, actually 3 and 4 here. So we had a pattern where they were, you know, focusing consistently, but focusing just not as perfectly. Back to some perfect results there at the end. So over the last 5 images, we defocused towards infinity. And so you can see I got a little more inconsistent results here. 2 that are 5-star, 2 that are 4-star, with 1 of that 3-star that we looked at in the middle. Now with the Canon, which starts here, we can see this was the worst example from the Canon, and it's like the worst example from the Tamron, where it's focused, you know, right up here at the front rather than at the target. That fortunately was the exception to the rule. So after that, during our you know, defocus to minimum focus, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 results that were perfectly focused. We got 1 4-star and then that 3-star. Now if we move towards the infinity focus, coming back, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of those were perfectly. So definitely from coming from infinity back to focus, we got better results with the Canon, and then mildly better results with the defocus towards minimum focus. So as you can see, not quite as good as what the Canon was. However, you know, going back to when I tested the Canon versus the Sigma 35mm F1.4 art, it's kind of a night and day performance from that, and that this lens is competing fairly well with the Canon, whereas the Sigma was, you know, way behind by comparison. And so anyway, I think that this, again, this lens is, it's not quite first party level, but as we saw, it's not far behind either. Now let's also take a look at how it does for, you know, autofocus performance when shooting video. For those of you who want to know about focus noise and how smooth it is in focus transitions, let's take a look at that. On 35mm F1.4. So as you can see, it's not completely silent, as essentially none of these lenses are that have ring type USM. This is USD, it's called ultrasonic. Ultrasonic silent drive is what USD stands for in Tamron speak, but they're never as quiet as what like a stepping motor is, which, you know, some variation of that is what is used in mirrorless scenarios. And so, but overall I would call that a solid, if not exceptional, performance when it comes to that. So in conclusion, what really sets the Tamron apart, I think, is not only that it performs as well or better than the first party comparisons. In my test, the Tamron is about as sharp in the center of the frame, and it's sharper at the edges of the frame than what the Canon lens is. And as you saw from our portrait section, it renders fantastic amounts of detail, great contrast, chromatic aberrations are controlled well, flare is well controlled. It just does a really great job in all those metrics. Only disadvantage I would point to is that the lens is not supported here on Canon on the lens aberration corrections, which means that your JPEGs are not going to be corrected, and neither is video, although in the case of most of the optical defects in terms of vignette, if you're shooting in 4K, the crop factor is so huge that's non-existent, at least on, you know, Canon's current bodies. That hopefully will change in the future. But anyway, that is the kind of the disadvantage. If you're shooting raw, it doesn't matter so much because you can apply the standard profile just as you would with a Canon lens in your post-processing. But just note that that is a potential issue there. The compatibility with the tap-in console means that because of firmware updates being easy to roll out, you don't have the same kind of compatibility issues that you once feared with third-party lenses, so I don't consider that to be a major consideration anymore. So what you're left with is a lens that is built as well or better than first-party lenses, performs as well or better than first-party lenses, and retails at $899 US bucks compared to around $1,600 or $1,700 for the Canon and Nikon variants. And so that makes this lens extremely compelling if you are shopping for a 35mm f1.4 lens for DSLRs. Those of you that already own Tamron's 35mm f1.8, note that where it doesn't compete, this new lens, is it only has about half of the reproduction ratio of that lens, and so you can't focus down as close as the VC lens. Also, obviously, it doesn't have image stabilization, so that might be a factor for you. However, it is much more special in its rendering. Obviously, it has a depth of field advantage, but it also has, it has higher sharpness and contrast. It also has a nicer bokeh rendering, and so it is the nicer lens, certainly if image quality is your priority. And so, of course, your mileage may vary. Again, your priorities may vary, but some of you have asked about that, so I did want to throw that out. Finally, if you're considering this lens versus the current Sigma 35mm f1.4 Art, the 35 Art was the first of the Art series lenses, and it shows its age in some ways. Its optics are not as good as what, say the more recent 28mm f1.4 Art is, and neither is the autofocus consistency and performance. I would like to see Sigma develop a Mark II of that lens, even for DSLRs. And of course, they do have a new FE 35mm f1.2, which I haven't tested yet, but by all accounts is pretty fantastic. But at the moment, I certainly would choose this lens every day of the week over the current Sigma 35mm f1.4 Art. So, take that for what it's worth as well. At the end of the day, though, I think Tamron's done a great job with this lens, and it's certainly worthy of your consideration. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review with a lot of information there, and maybe text is more your pace. Take a look at that. There's also a linkage there to look at the image gallery, and so you can look at photos and see if you like the look of photos out of the lens. Beyond that, there's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage to follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, become a patron, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.